Going to get started just in about 30 seconds or so. We are recording today's event so that you can watch it again later or send the link so that other folks can watch the video who missed it. I'm going to turn it over to Marcy now, and we look forward to seeing you on the other events as well.
Okay, Emily, thank you very much for getting us all started, and thanks to all the people behind the scenes here at CGS for the troubleshooting that they're doing. And to everyone on the call, welcome and thank you very much for helping us launch Talking Biopolitics, which is a series of conversations about the social meanings and implications of human genetic and reproductive technologies. What we're aiming for in these conversations is to think together about how we can approach more strategically the questions of how we bring our concerns, our shared concerns, to a broader public, and about how to get our ideas about this new emerging biopolitics onto policy agendas. As Emily mentioned, first of a series, we have 2 more events scheduled. We'll have on April 10th, David Winikoff interviewing Dorothy Roberts, and on May 8th, Harriet Washington will be interviewed by Lisa Ikamoto, and we'll send you more information about those. Today, we have the great pleasure of talking with Bill McKibben, and many of you know him and know his work. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him, just to remind you, and for those who may not be familiar with all the things he's done. I think it's fair to say Bill is best known as an environmental writer and activist, and he's focused especially on climate change. In fact, he wrote the book back in 1989 that's often described as the first book for a general audience about climate change, and that was The End of Nature. And he's got about a dozen other books as well, and often writes articles and op-eds in leading newspapers and magazines. He is the Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College in Vermont. And on top of all that, Bill has become an activist extraordinaire, in my view and many other people's views. In 2009, he founded an amazing grassroots climate campaign called 350.org, and that's also their URL, their website, so check it out if you haven't seen it. 350.org has now coordinated literally tens of thousands of rallies in scores of countries. I think, if I'm not mistaken, every country in the world except for North Korea. And in October 2009, 350 coordinated a series of rallies that Foreign Policy called the largest ever global coordinated rally of any kind. So that's pretty impressive. Last year and this year, Bill has been apparently quite busy as a leader and person for the massive environmental fight against the proposed Keystone XL pipeline project. He took part in one of the largest civil disobedience actions in America for the past decades and spent a couple days in jail in Washington, D.C. in the course of that. Now, Bill's efforts to confront climate change and his interest in human biotech issues are related, and we're going to talk some about that. In 2003, published his book on the politics of human biotechnology. It was called Enough: Staying Human in an Engineered Age, and it really still is one of the most significant books out there on the topic about the risks of abusing biomedical technologies for a high-tech eugenics. So I'm going to ask Bill some questions. Here's a little roadmap of where we're going today. We're going to leave time for Bill to answer some of your questions. And so, as Emily said, please submit those questions using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom right of your screen, the sort of screen that you come to when you enter the webinar. And you can send in those questions at any time. Folks here at CGS are going to help me organize those questions to ask Bill later. So having introduced Bill, and welcome Bill, most of the time an interview would then jump right into the Q&A, but I really want to take a minute first to say a few words about who else is on this call today. It's a sophisticated group of folks. It includes policy advocates and grassroots campaigners, scholars, academics, and independent scholars. Many of the people on the call have participated in the annual Tarrytown Meetings. That's an initiative that CGS started out to bring together groups and individuals who are working toward responsible uses of human biotechnologies and toward building a new biopolitics. And a few other people on the call were invited by participants in the Tarrytown Meetings network. There are a few people on the call who focus primarily on environmental issues, but nearly all of us are working in one way or another on issues related to human biotechnologies, and that's a range of issues. It's gene patents, it's synthetic biology, it's commercial surrogacy and egg retrieval and biobanks, as well as the human enhancement concerns that Bill, you focused on in enough. And I want to let you know and let everyone on the call know, too, that there are a couple people on the call, several people on the call, actually, who are now working full-time on human biotech issues, who've told me that your book, Bill, Enough, was where they first came to these issues. That was their introduction. So with that, let me start with a question that came to me recently. It actually came into my inbox. It's about a forthcoming article that I got an advance copy of, and this is an article written by 3 bioethicists. 2 of them have appointments at Oxford University, 1 of them at New York University. This is an article that will be published in a reputable journal. It's called Human Engineering and Climate Change, and the article proposes that a good way for us to address climate change would be to engineer our children so that they are shorter and thus their carbon footprint would be less. How does one respond to that? How would you reply?
Well, actually, this is interesting because the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the single biggest group fighting to prevent any real action on climate, and the biggest funder of any kind in our political system, gave more money in the last election than the RNC and the DNC combined. A couple of years ago, they filed a brief with the EPA saying that the EPA shouldn't take any action on climate change because even if on the off chance that the scientists were correct and it turned out to be true, we needn't worry because humans would, quote, alter their behavior and physiology in order to cope with a warmer world. It was never really clear to me what they were talking about. I was thinking sort of more growing gills, you know, or something, but maybe this is what they had in mind, that we should all become extremely small. Clearly, this is not even a, doesn't pass even, any test of seriousness for dealing with the biggest, most immediate problem humans have ever faced, climate change. The thing that, we have to do to deal with it is to get off coal and gas and oil. And it's sort of stuff like that from in that article that I haven't seen, but as you describe it, that reminds me of the of when I was writing Enough and reading what always struck me as the profoundly lightweight takes on the world coming from various biotechnologists of one kind or another, thinking about the future in ways that always involved altering, something to do with our physical makeup, and never to do anything with altering the ways that we arrange our society, the habits that we pursue, the inequalities that we face, all the things that really are at the core of what our troubles are.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think you're one of the people who really has seen a connection between the underlying mentality and the political and social dynamics that that have put us on this precipice of catastrophic climate change, and that pose all these really terrifying scenarios about the possible abuses of biomedical technologies. How do you see that as a similar dynamic? How do you see environmental issues and biotech issues as facets of a dynamic?
Well, let me say, I mean, for me, what was, I mean, the reason that I was attracted to writing enough and to that work was because it wasn't exactly that it was parallel to kind of environmental issues in general. It's because in certain ways it was parallel to climate change, which is an environmental issue on such a large scale that it almost ceases to be an environmental issue. That is to say, unlike, you know, smog or, you know, unlike water pollution, or unlike the things that we've been able to solve fairly easily, or would be able to solve if we put our minds to it with fairly minor technical fixes. Climate change is such an overarching problem that goes so to the center of our economies and lives, and whose implications are so deep for our future and all generations yet to come, that it's different not just in quantity but in quality. It's a kind of existential, profound topic that at its core is philosophical more than anything else. And that's what I mean, I think the same is true of the kind of human genetic engineering that I was writing about when I wrote Enough. Maybe less true or only partially true of some of the kind of steps along the way or the other fights that go on about certain things, you know, whatever it is, stem cells or whatever, but certainly true in a, you know, when you begin to talk about choosing characteristics for your baby and what kind of people we want and so on and so forth. To the degree that, as I wrote in 1989, climate change represents something like the end of nature, the end of the idea that there's ever going to be any place on the earth that's independent of human action. You know, so too that kind of strong human genetic engineering, the kind of, you know, thing that, you know, Lee Silver, Ray Kurzweil, anybody, whoever was kind of is kind of imagining, that represents the end of a kind of human nature. And to me, therefore, seemed incredibly philosophically interesting for the same ways. You can tell that as a writer and a journalist, my tendency is to pick very large questions, partly because they're the questions that people tend to leave lying around because they are so large. And so it was really interesting to engage. And of course, once you engage with them, you do find that many of the issues become the same. You know, can we, can we ignore all the issues about class and race and equality and everything else and just concentrate on some technological fix to our problems, or do we have to sort of begin with the world as it is?
That's a really good point, and also it raises the question of when you have these, the worst case scenarios of catastrophic climate change, and in the case of biopolitics of runaway high-tech eugenics, you also have to confront in the immediate, as an activist or as activists, as advocates, you have to confront the immediate problems, the pipeline or the gene patent.
That's right.
Do. And so how do you think about that?
That's right. Issues, as an activist as opposed to a writer, issues become ripe at certain points. You know what? My wife is calling. I'll be back in 30 seconds, Marcy. Something's wrong downstairs. Excuse me 1 second, okay?
Okay. In case anybody was wondering, this was not a rehearsed part of the webinar, so we'll hope that it's nothing alarming, that Bill can rejoin us right away. And please, everybody, send your questions in. I can see some of them here, and I think others at CGS are putting them.
things are okay. I apologize.
I'm glad things are okay.
So the issues become ripe at certain times. And that's when you can take political action on them. And it's very hard to do that, at least in a big way, in a kind of way that allows you to organize until they're ripe, until something happens that allows people to focus on them in a large way. Until then, you've got to do the kind of work that, we've been doing patiently in the climate movement for a very long time, building the networks of experts, doing the seminars, having the reports, building the kind of superstructure, because the moment will come, and who knows exactly what moment it is that will really galvanize people to act around this set of issues. I think I said it enough that my guess is, the moment that we'll really have political focus or something will be the moment when something like, someone clones a child or something like that. And so, in the case of this pipeline that we're fighting, the key moment was when Jim Hansen at NASA said, you know what, there's enough carbon up there in those tar sands in Alberta that if you burn it, it will be, quote, game over for the climate, unquote. And that was the kind of galvanizing moment and message that allowed this to blossom into the biggest civil disobedience action in 30 years in this country, and then we ringed the White House with people, and then we sent 800,000 messages to the Senate. We still may not win. I mean, big oil is incredibly powerful, more powerful even than big pharmacology, or whatever else. But at least we have a moment when we can make a fight, and then once you make one of these fights, then it has to be a kind of educational process to make the next one and the next one.
Yeah. I mean, we sometimes think that the state of understanding about human biotech issues is in some sense analogous to what the state of understanding was about environmental issues back in 1960 or so, before Rachel Carson wrote Violent Spring. But on the other hand, when you think about it in a different way, when human beings started burning fossil fuels a couple hundred years ago, I don't think anyone could have imagined what the climate effect and what we face now. But even before the biotech, well before the biotech revolution got underway, people were imagining what some of the worst scenarios would be.
So science fiction writers, as I said in Enough, are the only people who've seriously grappled, I think, with the implications of the world that's coming, or that could come, who have taken seriously the technologists and then tried to imagine what that world might look like. And the interesting thing to note about that is that as they've done so, science fiction has become, I don't know if people read it much, but I didn't until I was writing Enough, but it's not at all the kind of utopian, Buck Rogers in space kind of thing that it was once upon a time. It's now the most dystopian part of the bookshelf because, as novelists, as people who have to take seriously characters, the only characters to this point who've kind of moved into that world are fictional ones, they've had to grapple with this question of whether the scale of this proposed technology is compatible with the human scale or not. And in almost every case, those science fiction writers and things have decided that it isn't, that it quashes human scale.
Yeah, good point. So, Bill, you were talking about questions of issues becoming ripe and issues of timing. Do you have a sense of how the issues around human genetic enhancement and about biopolitics more generally have developed since you wrote Enough?
And it strikes me that there hasn't been a kind of threshold moment in those years. That the threshold moments so far were before that, and we haven't quite had things that rose to, things like Dolly the sheep or whatever, that quite grabbed attention in the same way. And I'm not quite sure, I mean, as usual, whatever the surprise is will be surprising, but one assumes that they're coming. What's been interesting to watch is for me, is the religious tenacity with which proponents of this coming world believe in it and keep announcing it and keep explaining that the singularity is at hand and so on and so forth, with the kind of fervent belief of, you know, people who go to the tops of hills and wait for God to rapture them and so on and so forth. There doesn't seem to be any, you know, it doesn't seem to me as if we're moving rapidly in that direction. The world seems to be getting, in fact, less singular all the time. But I don't think the debates moved much in those terms in the last 4 or 5 years.
So there have been quite a number of worrying, more incremental changes, like spreading practices of sex selection because that's what the parents want, and the advent of these this very aggressive marketing of genetic tests. Genetic
testing, that's right. So there've been, so everything, I mean, everything that, the thing to be careful of, the thing to watch for, the thing that I was trying to write about in that book was how the response of ethicists, to professional ethicists, to these sort of things is always to say, well, this is analogous to something else that we've already done, and hence it's okay, don't get bent out of shape about it. And sort of moving the bar, sort of moving the goalpost steadily down the field like that, you know, thing after thing after thing. At a certain point, you do have to be able to draw lines and say this far and no further, this is different. And that's, you know, that's what I was trying to do in Enough. That's what you guys often try to do around important things. My sense was, and is, that most people have a fairly good gut sense of what crosses those lines, and that this is something that drives the kind of fantasists of the technological future to despair, the kind of stubbornness with which normal people understand that altering children and things is not a good idea. It'll be when we hit one of those lines that really offends people's common sense. The analogy in the world where I spend most of my time in climate, you know, is that we're now really beginning to encounter exactly the kind of hideous and weird weather and things that the climatologists said we were going to. And in fact, people are beginning to respond in serious ways to that. And now the debate is sharpening and heightening, and we'll see.
Let me ask you about something that's, I think, quite different in the way that the political dynamics between the two kinds of issues play out. And that is that on the issue of climate change, the resistance comes, as you said, from the large corporations, and then also from this group of climate deniers, people who are, for whatever reason, saying that they're skeptical about the science, which is as close to a consensus as most anything. And so it's mostly from the right side of the political spectrum. But in the biopolitical world, we all too often find resistance to taking seriously what the threat is from the progressive end of the spectrum, from people who are our allies on climate change and on any number of other issues. What do you make of that?
Well, I think part of it is just that, well, I mean, part of it is that there's the idea of what constitutes left and right and progressive and things is never very clear to me. I mean, I remember reading, as I was reading all this stuff, all the sort of, you know, sort of what passes for kind of academic progressivism, you know, all the kind of endless papers about how if you wear eyeglasses, you're a cyborg, and that's just about exactly the same as having, you know, some new brain implanted in you and whatever else. I don't think our use of the terms progressive and conservative and things is very well developed in these things. I got to say, on both these counts, it strikes me that in certain deep ways, I'm kind of conservative. That is, I think that the world that we were born into has a fair amount going for it. You know, at the very least, one should be careful about monkeying around with it. Certainly, environmentally, it had a lot going for it. You know, the Holocene had lasted for 10,000 years of climatic stability, and that was a good idea, and it was a really poor idea now to alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere. You know, human nature has worked reasonably well, too. Clearly, there are people who have all kinds of problems that can and should be helped, and there are plenty of ways to do that, short of, you know, altering people's children. And that's important for everybody to realize and grapple with, and not be sort of conservative in that sense, but in some deeper sense, has some allegiance to the idea that human beings are actually okay. I mean, the reason I called the book Enough was the argument was, you know what, we're good enough, just like the planet we live on is good enough. And endless efforts to, quote, improve it, unquote, are hubristic in all kinds of ways. They're likely to lead us into technological trouble and mistakes and errors and things, but they're also philosophically dubious, I think. And so, you know, it's really important that we figure out how to make sure that everybody in the world has access to electricity, so that they can have, we can have refrigerator to keep vaccines cold in every part of the world. You know, it's not important that we figure out how to have anybody have access to Learjet. You know, in the same way, it's important that we let every person who gets born onto this planet, have what we can provide them to let them live out a dignified life. It's not important, and it's in fact stupid to, I'm sort of remembering back all the things I was reading, working on then, that, that we engineer people so that they become smarter, or so they can enjoy, stupendous orgasms unlike any that humans have ever experienced, or that all the other fantasies listed in such endless detail by the enthusiasts of a new age.
Yeah. Well, let me turn to a few questions that have come in from some of the folks that are on the call. If genetic engineering is the end of human nature, someone asks, is that really in itself such a bad thing? The idea of human nature has inspired artists and activists, but it's also been used to justify oppression of all kinds.
Well, I'm not sure it's good thing, bad. I mean, it's just what is. It's important to realize that, the sort of things that technologists think are oppressive to us, like the fact that we die, are in some other way definitional of who we are, And if we stop dying, or if we engineer our children to become incredibly pious and devout, or if we, there's an endless list of things that people talk about doing, all of which end up with us being very different than who we are now, that take away the really powerful hallmarks of human nature, a certain kind of free will, that replace, I began the book with an analogy that, remains, it seems to me, useful, because it's an analogy we still think and talk a lot about. One of the few places where biotechnology routinely makes the news, and that's with its application to sports and athletics, and people's great desire to enhance themselves so they can go faster or whatever. And as I pointed out in there, and I've never yet had anyone successfully explain to me why this is, contradict this, and very few people even try. I mean, yes, you could theoretically, engineer people probably fairly easily so that they could run the marathon faster than they're running it now, and more easily. and you could have a whole bunch of them doing it. You know, you probably, you know, maybe you could make it so that someone could run the marathon in an hour and not feel any pain, and, you know, that'd be great. The point of running the marathon is not to finish as quickly as possible, you know. The point of it is that it is difficult and hard, and that's why it's a significant thing for people to go do. If you want to get to the finish of the marathon fast, you know, get on a motorcycle, you know, and the same with, you know, with life in general. You know, I remember the one of the crux moments for me in kind of reading the literature was, you know, coming across people talking very much about how they'd engineer their children to program sort of who they would fall in love with and what kind of, you know, person they'd be, you know, who they'd be attracted to. That's such an affront to human nature, not to mention so filled with the possibilities for oppression of all kinds, for trying to stamp out human difference and whatever, that it's so painful to contemplate.
What were some of the things, you've mentioned a couple times already in this conversation, things that you came across as you were researching for the book enough. What were some of the things that surprised you in the way that the book was received and when you were, you know, doing events and promotion?
So the book was very interesting. It was and kind of remains one of the few books. It's sort of sui generis in a way, because it takes seriously the possibility that these guys are describing, and it thinks it's really uncool. So for the most part, the only people who've taken it seriously are people who think it is cool. So it was kind of odd for that world to have someone take them seriously and think it was stupid. Not just stupid. I mean, uncool is an important part of it. I mean, this is a world of fantasists, mostly men, in my experience, mostly obsessed with not dying, and so on. And I've gotten to know a few of them and like them. The most interesting, and the guy I thought was afterwards most willing to kind of at least hear another side and so on, was Ray Kurzweil, who's a good writer and an interesting guy, and utterly and completely obsessed with the idea that he's going to die. I mean, I've sat in his office and watched him take 100 pills at a time, to make sure that he survives long enough to be, whatever's going to happen, be cryogenically frozen and then biologically enhanced and turned into a cyborg, all the other 93 things that he's convinced are going to happen. And so it was interesting to get to kind of have the philosophical conversation with them. I think most people still, as you know, look at this, all this kind of thing, and just think, you know what, this is far enough off still that I'm not going to worry about it yet, because I've got other things to worry about in my life. And that's, at the moment, that's why it's, for this movement, important to be in the stage you're exactly in, building the networks, building the ideas, having the kind of dialogue among people who are paying attention, challenging the nonsense, embracing the kind of interesting questions, figuring out where some of the bright lines might be. All those sort of tasks are really important.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. A lot of people on this call, and people who are part of the Tarrytown Meetings networks, are writers, they're scholars. Some have their primary identities as advocates. But you've really combined those identities and those roles and those daily activities. And what are your thoughts about that? What lessons have you learned about how to do it, how to do it well?
Well, it's sort of a work in progress and hard and not where I thought I would end up and so on and so forth. I mean, in the climate change thing, it was just, there was nobody else building a movement, and so finally we just sort of figured out we had to, and from scratch we've tried. I mean, you know, I still think of myself mostly as a writer, though it's not mostly what I do anymore. And, you know, that means that one's basic commitment is to telling the truth and so on, which is important. That's, you know, advocates can tend to privilege advocacy over truth telling sometimes, and it's important to avoid that. But it's also important to be able to just say very forthrightly what's going on. And I think in certain ways engaging in advocacy makes one think with more power about these issues, because you're forced to figure out what they mean to other people and how other people engage them, and then try to meet that, deal with that. It's why organizing is always, on anything, is such a fascinating occupation, you know, because you're really, you move very much from the abstract into the concrete. And it's interesting to see how much of your, you know, how much of your perspective, how much of your soul you can hold on to while you're doing that. I've enjoyed it a lot. You know, I've had the privilege of working with young people mostly. We started 350.org with myself and 7 college seniors, and within a couple of years had grown into the largest grassroots environmental campaign the planet's ever seen. So it's possible without money and within it to make good progress on these kind of things. And one of the things we did that may be useful to think about is, in a weird sense, not shy away from the science, even its technicalities. We kind of embraced them. That's why the thing's called 350.org. It's a nod to what scientists say is the parts per million CO2 that it's safe to have in the atmosphere. It's a pretty wonky scientific data point from which to organize.
Yeah. Well, a couple of people on the call I want to know your thoughts about the synthetic biology issue. Now that's that we've been following a bit, in part because it seems like such an important set of developments, in part because some of the leading figures in the synthetic biology field have made no bones about saying, oh yeah, we're going to use synthetic biology to redesign our children. So there's that direct link. Drew Endy said something like that in the New Yorker profile of him. Jim Thomas and Neil Saper, who are both on the call, wanted to ask your thoughts about, let's see, Jim says the mainstream climate movement, and including 350, has been vocal in talking about moving away from fossil carbon, but hasn't talked much about the false solutions of bioenergy, biofuels, biomass, all of which get sort of bundled and long-term renewables. And the danger is that this could lend power to the biotech, the part of the biotech industry that's about this. It's about biomass. How can we build greater solidarity?
Well, that's an important place to be working. I got to tell you, the truth is that the climate fight is, we're losing so badly, and the planet is, you know, that the room for finesse is small. You know, the fight is you're right. I mean, we've concentrated on fighting fossil fuel. But as soon as you start doing that, lots of other things come up. So this sort of fight about biomass stuff has been, you know, interesting in the last couple of years, and I've gotten to join in a little bit here in the Northeast, sort of trying to block some of these plans for huge industrial scale biomass and things. One of the things that we're finding, and that I write about a lot in my intellectual work on these topics, is that, you know, scale and control and power are key. Any solution, even a reasonably good one, applied at a large enough scale becomes a bad one, a large enough level of power or control or scale. So, you know, I mean, biomass in some level works okay. I've been, you know, burning wood in my wood stove my whole life. and I have a well-managed woodlot, and whatever. But at a much larger scale, it becomes a huge problem, and so we do have to work on that. It's things that appeal to the part of our minds that like quick, easy fixes that are trouble, that allow us to imagine that we're not actually going to have to change anything significant, that we're just going to pull out the internal combustion engine and toss in a windmill or a biomass plant or something like that. We need to really engage the conversation in a deep way, and the same is true of human genetic engineering. We need to engage it at the level where it really matters, I think, instead of trying to find the easiest way around it.
Going back to something you said earlier, Tina Stevens is on the call, wonders about these moments when something big happens that really alerts people to some of these deeper issues at stake. And Tina asks about the moment some years back when a British public interest group, Human Genetics Alert, actually revealed research development. Some researchers at Cornell had created the world's first genetically modified human embryo. Yeah. And this did not become a threshold moment. So Tina's, I think the question is, how come? Why didn't it?
Yeah, and I can't remember the details of it well enough to know that, but because it didn't, probably because it still didn't become kind of real enough for people to, I mean, as I recall, this was, grew to a small size, 16 right. cells or whatever it was, and no, I remember the moment when, though it was pretty clear to any of us who were paying attention that it wasn't real, when this almost happened, when people almost focused, and it was when 10 years ago that cult announced that they were cloning children. Right. I've forgotten the guy's name now. Rael. I in fact interviewed Rael in his spacesuit and things. And that actually, it's like, yeah, okay, people suddenly like, okay, I'm focused now. Is this real? What's going on here? It was on the front of the Times. It was on the evening news. It was because we were suddenly dealing with things that people could understand. In the same way that, when Hurricane Katrina struck, we were dealing with things people could understand in a way that we weren't when we were dealing with climate models,
Right. So that gets us back to this importance of doing the fundamental work on the issues that are important in and of themselves, but that are incremental towards where we hope we never have to go, towards the nightmare scenario. Of the issues that we are dealing with now, the genetic testing issue, the testing of ourselves and our toddlers and fetuses, and the issue of sex selection and commercial surrogacy and gene patents and DNA forensics, are there some that you feel will grab people more than others, and how might we use them to?
I'm kind of surprised, frankly, that sex selection hasn't grabbed people more than it has. To me, it's offensive, I got to say. And I'm sort of surprised that it isn't more offensive to a wide variety of people on both left and right. At the moment, we're in this political moment, when we're giving an enormous amount of space to the idea that people should be able to do anything the hell they want and don't tell me what to do. And that may be sort of what's going on. But it amazes me that, for instance, people on the right, for whom apparently the idea that, their university might have to provide contraception, that's, repugnant, have no problem with the idea that we, are choosing what gender of child to have. That's if I were spending my time working in this area, that's a place where I'd be kind of trying to really focus attention and seeing if people really are comfortable with it or if they just don't really know what's going on.
Well, you know, actually, this is something that's been going on a little bit behind the scenes, but the people who oppose abortion rights actually have been strategizing explicitly about using the issue of sex selections and the offense that a lot of people take from it to divide the reproductive rights movement, and have been using it as a wedge. Have actually even introduced legislation in Congress and in some state legislatures to ban sex-selective and what they call race-selective abortions. So that's a place where we really run up against this problem of the political dynamics.
Completely fascinating, yeah, completely fascinating. And I have no good way out of it, but I think that that's probably a sign that it's a really interesting place. And I don't, you know, I don't take lightly the idea. I think it's something we really should be thinking hard about. Doesn't strike me that it's a good reason to be doing things.
Yeah. This actually segues into a question that comes from Adam Smith on the call. He asks, how do you think a government should develop policy in regards to these biopolitical matters? How should the government...
Yeah, this is a really good question. It's hard to do because the level of sort of engagement and understanding is low, but governments have done a good job in certain places. Marcy, you'll remember this better than I do, but it strikes me that when I was writing that book, Canada was in the process of doing this kind of nationwide, really informed kind of debate, sort of formal debate, you know, having lots of public information sessions and so on and so forth. And as I recall, the place that they and some of the EU countries and things came down was, you know, one that struck me as reasonably sound and fit with people's kind of gut instinct. All right to do work on stem cells and that kind of stuff. Not a good idea to do germline genetic engineering.
Yeah, that's right. And the Canadian legislation, we thought, really cut it just right, but it has, you know, been kind of stymied by issues of federal versus provincial jurisdiction in Canada, and then just, I think, some bureaucratic foot-dragging. But
the process was an interesting one. They actually managed to get people up and educated about this.
That's right.
Long enough to actually reach some kind of consensus.
Yes.
And I think there's a number of the EU countries had vaguely similar processes and outcomes, as I recall.
That's true. That's very right, and it's something that very few people still know, and something that, you know, is one of the points we strive to make over and over as we confront this new biopolitics, with mixed results. And I guess that's always how it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about in terms of the political dynamics of these issues, of biopolitical issues and environmental and climate change issues, is this kind of weird, really, accusation that gets thrown around a lot about how anyone raising any kind of critical question about a technological innovation or development is called a Luddite. How have you come to deal with that?
Oh, I just paid. I mean, that's just an attempt to shut people up, you know. It's crazy. I mean, what it really just demonstrates is that there's, our normal relationship with technology in this country is just to say, whatever people invent, we'll use, you know, which is the most uncritical, unthinking, unengaged. I think I may have written in enough. I mean, you know, the most interesting technological thinkers in our society are probably the Amish, because they actually look at new technologies and they do look at each thing that comes out. People engage with, use, explore, and then they decide whether they think it's useful for their community or not, you know. They're kind of the opposite of Luddites, but they're forever called that. So I just think it's it's absurd. I mean, what you have to say is, no, I'm not a Luddite. I just don't, I just don't fall in love with every girl who walks down the street. That doesn't mean I'm asexual. It just means I'm able to choose. I actually have a deep enough relationship with technology that I can figure out whether something's a good idea or a bad idea or not. And you just don't, And the second cousin to this argument is people saying, well, it's all right for you to figure out, but don't tell anybody else what they should be doing, whatever. I mean, which is absurd too. When we're talking about climate change or about changing what human beings are or something else, the effects are obviously societal as well as individual, and hence we all have a major stake in the outcome, and no one should be intimidated by that kind of stuff. It's just schoolyard stuff to keep you from playing,
Yes. Well, maybe let me ask you one more question as we, kind of start to wind down here, and that is, I have a feeling this will be an inspiring way to end. You've had what seems to me like the great good fortune of being able to work with a lot of young people in .org and the climate change movement, and I just wonder, well, a specific thing. Do you ever talk with them? Are they aware of any of these biopolitical issues? But then in general, what's it been like to work with all those young folks, and what is it give you?
Yes. Yeah. So we don't talk about them too much because, frankly, the work that we're doing is so overwhelming, and so constant and so pressing and so not even 5 minutes in the future, but very, our problem is we may have waited, too long to have gotten started. It may be behind us, the possibilities for real intervention. We're just scrambling all the time. But here's what's important, I think. Younger people have a visceral and gut sense of community that older people, I think, lack, and I think the reason is because those of us who are older grew up in a strange moment where, almost uniquely in human experience, there was very little community. We were watching TV and living in the suburbs, the great devices to make sure we didn't connect with each other. People who grow up on the web have a somewhat different relationship. They have a visceral sense of the way that people are connected around the world. And it's that gulf between community and individuality, hyper-individuality, that seems to me crucial here. And that if we can build a world where communities start to work, where people think of themselves as parts of communities as much as their own damn selves all the time, then we have some chance of dealing with climate change and some chance of dealing with human genetic engineering and some chance of dealing with the, insane inequality that sparked the Occupy movement and some chance of dealing with a lot of other things. That kind of hyper-individualism reaches its apogee in people who think that it's, all right for them to have designed their children, it seems to me. In that sense, probably more than any other, all these fights are profoundly linked because in some level, they really are about what our sense of what a human being is. And are we, in the end, do we, in the end, owe a lot to past and future and to everyone around us, or are we, in the end, just, unmoored hyper-individuals on our own little islands? And the answer to that question will determine whether, we keep the temperature sane, whether we build a, race of cyborgs, whether we do a lot of other things or don't do a lot of other things over the next 30 or 40 years. Because the technological ability to do that stuff is certainly to change the temperature is right there. We're doing it. And what remains to be seen is whether we can capture that part of us, and I think it is mostly a community part of us that understands the virtues of restraint, that has that kind of fundamentally conservative sense that the world that we were born into is worth its largest dimensions preserving.
Well, that does seem like a good note to end on. So, Bill, thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for your good work.
Yeah, thank you
all
for
care, guys.
the call, and we will be in touch. Bye-bye.